All right, so we are moving on here with Faust Part 2, and now we're up to Act 2, the first couple of scenes here. In this video, we'll look at the first scene, narrow, high-vaulted Gothic chamber, erstwhile Faust's, unchanged. So we go back to Faust's study, where the play originally opened up in Part 1, and then into the laboratory with the creation of the Homunculus, and we might glance at the first part of the classical Walpurgisnacht, now that comes in as a countercompensation to the romantic Walpurgisnacht. So in Act 2, Scene 1, Mephistopheles comes in. Now recall that what has just happened is that they have summoned up for the court the shades of Helen of Troy and Paris, and here's an image of them, Helen and Paris together, as the most beautiful man and most beautiful woman of antiquity. And Faust wants to possess her. He has wanted to possess her all along. And recall that when the shade of Helen appeared on the stage, Faust reaches out and tries to grab her, and he holds her, and then suddenly there's an explosion, and both of them disappear. Both she and Paris then disappear. So Faust now, as Mephistopheles is dragging him back to his study, so now note that they've retreated back from the emperor's world of the Holy Roman Empire and gone back into Germany, into Wittenberg, and they're inside Faust's chamber, and he's knocked out still. He's asleep. Mephistopheles puts him in a bed. He's so knocked out from his encounter with Helen. So now, note that his encounters with Helen, there's three main ones, as Rudolf Steiner in his commentary to Faust mentions. He says, recall that back in Part 1 in the witch's kitchen, when Faust saw they were preparing the potion to make him 30 years younger, and he saw in the magic mirror an image of a perfectly beautiful woman, like the sort of Playboy centerfold image, let's say, but it was Helen. It represented a glimpse of Helen's divine beauty, and so that corresponded to purely conceptual Helen, thinking, in other words, says Rudolf Steiner. And then the second encounter with Helen, where they have brought Helen up from the underworld, and he has taken his magic key, which is an analog for a phallus, and brought her up, as though to go down and generate her image in the underworld so that she can come up at the court. Then he has this emotional, overwhelming explosion of feeling toward her. So then this moves, according to Steiner, to feeling now, with the second encounter with Helen. And now, with the third encounter in the Helena, which will be Act 3, it moves to willing, to the deeper version of Helen, where she becomes concrete, and he has sex with her, and they have a child named Euphorion. And so, note then, too, that Faust's desire to possess Helen is really the anima, the animating muse of the classical, it's the soul of classical civilization, the Greco-Roman civilization, whereas Faust is the soul of Northwestern Faustian civilization. So this civilization wants to possess the soul of antiquity for itself, and what it ends up producing with the child Euphorion then, who dies, he tries to fly and he falls to his death, represents the fusion then of what we have achieved in the West, the fusion of classical civilization with Faustian civilization. So that's what this desire is about, to possess the soul of Helen. And it moves then from thinking to feeling to willing, according to Steiner. And so Mephistopheles drags him in, and then he's looking around. He's like, well, the place looks pretty much still the same, only it's dustier. And he puts on Faust's gown again, as to shake out a chorus of insects. And as they're falling out of the gown, they all say a little song. And then Mephistopheles sits down, making himself at home, and then he pulls at the bell, which resounds with a piercing clangor. And then in comes Wagner's assistant, who is called a famulus, Wagner now has his own assistant, because Wagner has moved up in knowledge now. He's busy, as we'll see in the next scene, creating an artificial human being, the homunculus. And the famulus says, what was that din I just heard? And he has a brief exchange with Mephistopheles, who sends him on his way. And then now the student comes in. He is now a baccalaureus. So it's been years since Mephistopheles had put on Faust's gown in Part 1, and at the beginning of it, one of the opening scenes, where the student had come in and he had fun with him, sort of making fun of academe and telling him he should learn this, that, the other thing. And he was kind of trying to steer him in the wrong direction. So now the baccalaureus comes back thinking that it's Faust again, because Mephistopheles is wearing his outfit. And now he's arrogant. He's graduated, and he's just kind of a prick. full of self-conceit. His ego is overblown and inflated, as so many academics' egos are once they obtain a PhD. And then Mephistopheles, he's rude to Mephistopheles. This section contains several references, though, to the German idealist philosophers like Schelling, Hegel, and Schopenhauer. On page 192, at the end of the scene, the baccalaureus says, "Ah, this is youth's most noble destiny. The world was not until I made it be." Schopenhauer was a friend of Goethe, at least for a while, and Goethe was one of the only people who took him seriously at that time and actually read The World as Will and Representation. And this is a reference to its opening line, "The world is my idea," which leads to solipsism. And there's a reference where he tells the student, just don't go home quite in the absolute. In other words, the absolute is Schelling's and Hegel's, because Hegel actually took it from Schelling. The idea of the absolute is God is the absolute, the ultimate. And he's sort of making fun of him, telling him, don't go home too puffed up with your idea of the absolute. Not that Goethe didn't like these guys, because he did. Fichte also, he knew personally in Jena. Fichte had moved to Jena due to Goethe. And Schiller was also living in Jena. And this was in the 1790s. But by the time he's writing this scene, which is, I think, 1828 or 29, many years later, he's writing about people who were either caricaturing those guys or writing witty little satires on German idealism. And he's sort of, the student is a caricature of that. The student couldn't hold a candle to these guys if he tried. And that's sort of what Goethe is trying to convey in this brief scene. So then the next scene, which is one of my favorites in the work, the laboratory in the medieval manner. Extensive cumbrous sets of apparatus for fantastic purposes. Okay, let's take a look at an illustration here that we have of Mephistopheles looking over Wagner's shoulder as he creates the homunculus in an alchemist's alembic. And I'm going to read this scene because I think there's a lot going on in it. Wagner at the furnace says, "There booms the bell." So he's heard the Mephistopheles in the other room ringing the bell. From city wall thrills shuddering reverberation. No longer can the doubt endure of most momentous expectation. There the veils of darkness fall. In the alembic's inmost member a glow is lit, like living ember. Yes, like a glorious jewel spark, it shoots, it flashes through the dark. A glare of dazzling white is sent. This once, let me not lose the battle. Oh God, the door, what is this rattle? And notice that what he's talking about is he's been trying to create life from matter, from material substance. And so Goethe now is moving on into the next, he's being prescient about one of the next Faustian inventions, namely genetic engineering. That's what this is about. And the homunculus comes from alchemy. It was first articulated by Paracelsus in his book on the nature of things, which it dates from something like 1529. Paracelsus is an exact contemporary of the historical Faust, where he comes up with this concept of the homunculus, which is something that you make, he says, from a man's sperm fertilized with horse dung and put into an alembic for 40 days. And you put it through these processes, and eventually he claims you could produce a living human being from all of this, a homunculus, which is a tiny human. Human. And so this is science's attempt now to, in the laboratory, to create artificial life. And at this point, it might be a good point to stop here and think about this for a second. Because what has happened here with science is that this is what I call, science has appropriated the metaphysical vulva that creates life from nature, and it is now the paternal vulva that has stolen the powers of the goddess and Gaia and the earth to create artificial humans in a laboratory. So this is the paternal vulva. So how I came about this concept is I noticed that in Lacan has this idea of the phallus, which exists on three different registers: the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. The phallus on the level of the real is simply the penis. The phallus on the level of the imaginary, though, is the child, the pre-Oedipal child, who thinks that it has to be the phallus for the mother. It always has to be within the gaze of the mother, and then the child worries, when mother's not around, what is mother doing? Is she consorting with father? What's going on? And so the child thinks that it has to be It has this imaginary idea that it is the phallus for the mother. But what has to happen there, according to Lacan, is a symbolic castration where the child has to accede, has to let go of being the phallus for the mother and to accede to the paternal order of the name of the father, which then is the phallus on the register of the symbolic. So a symbolic castration has to take place because, for as far as Lacan was concerned, the father is the spiritual element par excellence. So there's nothing in there that refers to the vulva at all. And so what we could do is take this idea of the metaphysical vulva and plug it into the real, which of course is the actual vagina, then the imaginary, then the symbolic. Now, on the order of the imaginary, the metaphysical vulva on the order of the imaginary is the symbolic goddess, the goddess herself, and which goes all the way back to the Paleolithic caves and all the way down to the first generation of high civilization with both the Sumerians and the Egyptians, who have the metaphysical vulva all along. They view the cosmos as essentially a uteromorphic container surrounded by a world ocean that's basically a sort of amniotic ocean from out of which things spontaneously emerge. And so the goddess has the power, as she does in the opening pages of Hesiod's Theogony, to give birth spontaneously. That is to say, a virgin birth, parthenogenetic. Parthenos means virgin. And give birth to beings, as Gaia spontaneously gives birth to both Uranos, Tartarus, Eros, Chaos. All these principles, these beings come out of her. And so that corresponds to Sloterdijk's three phases of history, where he talks about there's the metaphysical age that Heidegger invented from Plato, that stretches from Plato to down to Nietzsche. But before that, Sloterdijk says, would be the pre-metaphysical epoch, when being in the world meant a being in the body of the mother. That's basically the same thing as what I'm talking about here with the maternal vulva on the level of the imaginary, the mythological consciousness structure, according to Jean Gebser, let's say. Then he has the metaphysical age, which is when being in the world meant a being in the father, which is the metaphysical age, which is the symbolic register, the phallus on the register of the symbolic, which is the metaphysical age that goes, corresponds to Derrida's logocentric age, which goes all the way down then to Nietzsche. And after Nietzsche, being in the world means being thrown in the world, with Heidegger and his idea of being thrown, thrownness, where a real outside now appears for the first time in the human being, is both motherless and fatherless, and has no uteromorphic protective macrospheres or cosmological spheres to protect him or her. So now, with my idea of the metaphysical vulva in the age of the metaphysical age, where being means being in the father, now we have deities in both Greek and Hebrew myth that are giving birth parthenogenetically as though they were virgins. They have already appropriated the magical powers of the vulva. In the case of Zeus, he gives birth to Athena from his head. He has to have Prometheus come with an axe and chop it open and she just springs out of his head. That's the paternal vulva. Also, Dionysus is born from his thigh. The fetus has to be sewn into his thigh, but he does give birth to it from his thigh. Just as in the opening pages of the book of Genesis, then, Yahweh gives birth to Eve by pulling a rib out of Adam's body and creating Eve. Men do not give birth to women. It's the other way around. So there's been, in both the Greek appropriation of the maternal vulva into the paternal vulva, and with the Hebrews, the same idea of a paternal vulva now, which eventually evolves to become father science. And then science inherits this paternal vulva idea all the way down to the present day, where it is doing experiments creating, let's say for instance, in the Wuhan laboratory, what's called a Frankenstein virus. The COVID virus has all these different elements that have been taken from different viruses and genetically engineered to become an extraordinarily lethal and dangerous virus through gain-of-function research. You give it the function to invade human cells. So that's the paternal vulva, that the creation of life in the laboratory. And this is what Goethe is referring to here with this already looking ahead to what genetic engineering will do and the horrors that it will unleash. So we've already had the Wuhan virus as one of the first examples of genetic pollution, a byproduct from genetic engineering. And then so Mephistopheles enters and says, "My welcome, it is kindly meant." Wagner says apprehensively, "Welcome to the hour's good star," and under his breath, "But word and breath from egress firmly bar." a glorious work will shortly be displayed. Mephistopheles, what's going on? Wagner, more softly, a man is being made. And then notice that Mephistopheles says, a man? And what young pair in passion did you imprison in the flue? God forbid, Wagner says, begetting in the former fashion, namely fucking. The former fashion was fucking, but here fucking is being relegated to the past now by science. We don't need to reproduce human beings that way anymore, now that we can do it artificially in labs. The tender point from which new life would surge, the potent grace that from within would urge, and taking, giving was to lime itself, absorb first kindred, then remote for self, has now been ousted from its age-old sway. If brutes delight still in the former way, then man with his superior resource must henceforth have a higher source. Then he turns back to the alembic. Look, it shines. Now one may properly start hoping that if, mid hundreds of ingredients groping, by mixing, for on mixture things depend, the stuff of humankind we keep composing, in a retort enclosing, and cohabating well the blend, the quiet toil will prosper in the end. Turns back to the furnace. It's coming now. The swirl is clearing duly. Conviction too, more truly. What we extolled as nature's deep conundrum, we venture now to penetrate by reason, and what she did organically at random, we crystallize in proper season, namely with the mind, with the intelligence. And note here too, it is very possible that Goethe has read Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein. He probably did read it, although the homunculus myth goes all the way back to Paracelsus, and we know that Goethe also read Paracelsus. So there may be a dual influence coming in here. And Mephistopheles says, he who has lived has learned a lot. To him the world can offer nothing new. Upon my wanderings from spot to spot, I've come across synthetic people too. Wagner says, still continuing to watch the alembic, it swells, it gleams, piles up and on. In just a moment it is done. A great design appears at first insane, but chance will soon seem quaint and blind, and such an exemplary thinking brain will soon, by thinkers, be designed. So Goethe's already looking ahead here to artificial intelligence and the possibilities of creating artificial intelligence with computers. Watching the alembic in rapture, he says, the glass grows tuneful with its lovely power. It's clouding, clearing, nearly done within. I see in shapely harmony cower a dainty little mannequin. What more do we desire? What more the world? For now the secret is in reach. Let this vibration but be heard, and it will turn to voice to speech. And of course, if anyone has seen James Whale's 1930 Frankenstein film, this corresponds to the scene when he has taken the monster and harnessed electricity to make it come alive, and he yells in ecstasy, "It's alive!" It's the same exact scene. And note too that it's only because Mephistopheles has entered that now Wagner's experiments have been a success. Notice that he started this scene by complaining that it hasn't worked before. He had said, this once let me not lose the battle. So it hasn't been working, and it doesn't work until Mephistopheles shows up to provide the magical spark to make it work. So once again, Mephistopheles is credited with yet another technological innovation. We have seen him invent the printing press and paper currency, women's makeup, and now it's genetic engineering. There'll be more as we go along. And then so out pops the homunculus, and it's just in this flask, and then it's floating. It has the ability to float. And the homunculus is a tiny human soul without a body. It's just pure mind. And as such, it comes out extraordinarily intelligent. And Goethe, in one of his sketches, says the homunculus contains a world catalog within his head, almost like the internet, let's say. A world catalog where he knows everything, anywhere, at any time. Even more so than Mephistopheles, whom he intimidates a bit. And so the homunculus, he's a bit comical. He jumps up in the alembic and he says, well there, Papa, to Wagner, as though he were Adam on the first day that Yahweh has blown life into him, which is hilarious to think of Wagner in the role here of Yahweh. How now? It was no jest. Clutch me affectionately to your breast, but not too roughly, or the glass might shatter. Such is, you see, a property of matter. Things natural find all the world scant space, whilst things synthetic want a sheltered place. To Mephistopheles, what ho, the rogue! Sir cousin, you here too? You're right on cue. I'm obliged to you. A thoughtful fate has timed it well enough. In other words, he's saying, he only came into existence because Mephistopheles is there. A thoughtful fate has timed it well enough. Since I exist, I must be ever active. I feel like getting down to work right off. Where I need shortcuts, you would be effective. Wagner says, a word before. I have been much embarrassed, by old and young with ceaseless problems harassed. No one has fathomed, naming one at random, how body and soul from such a jointless tandem, a timeless seeming bond like brother and sister, or like brother and brother, and yet make life so wretched for each other. Secundo, Mephistopheles, stop. I would consult him rather why man and wife fall out with one another. A poser, friend, a quest that never ends. Here's work to do, just what the imp intends. And in his sketch that Goethe wrote for this, he was originally going to have Wagner accompany them to, in the next sequence, the next big sequence, the classical Walpurgisnacht, and Wagner was going to accompany them with another little flask, and he would carry the homunculus in his right breast jacket, and in the left he would try to find pieces that he could cobble together to create a homunculus female in the other flask on the left breast, which is a reference, of course, to the left always being associated with the female, the inferior side, as it's traditionally been thought of, the darker side, the sinister side. But he scrapped that, and so Wagner doesn't get to go. Homunculus says, what's there to work on? Mephistopheles, pointing to a side door, is pointing to Faust sleeping. Here your gifts employ. Wagner, still gazing into the alembic, my word, you are a captivating boy. The side door opens, revealing Faust, stretched on the couch, and the homunculus, astonished. Momentous! The alembic slips from Wagner's hands to float over Faust and illuminate him. Now, Steiner points out that what Homunculus is doing is he can tune into Faust's dream and see what he's dreaming because he has clairvoyant abilities as well. And what he sees is the myth of the birth of Helen, Leda and the Swan, which is a type of virgin birth. And here we have, this is the actual painting that Goethe had in mind here and that he's describing by Correggio, about 1529 or so, something like that, with the swan here in Leda's naked lap. And from this union will produce two sets of eggs, one containing both Helen and her sister Clytemnestra, and the other containing both the Dioscuri, Castor, and Pollux, one of whom is mortal and the other is immortal, and they, of course, become the Gemini in the constellations of the night sky. And so this is a virgin birth, and which is and it corresponds perfectly here to the Christian Annunciation. Only here, and this is Jan van Eyck's Annunciation, or one of them. And I like how they look like little dolls in a dollhouse here. It's very charming. And he's got Gabriel, who always comes in, the winged being from the left, who announces to Mary that she is going to be the vessel, the holy vessel that will contain the Logos, the word which descends on her here, not in the form of a swan, but in the form of a dove. So it's the same thing, this virgin birth. And so Homunculus describes it. Let's go back to the painting here so you can see Goethe's description is pretty exact of the painting. Where the homunculus says, fair environed, limpid waters in a dense grove, young nymphs their garments shedding, sweet sight, now sweeter still. Yet mid these daughters, one who outglistens all her lustrous setting, of hero kin, perchance of godly name, she dips a foot into that lucidness, as she's doing here. The flawless body's graceful living flame is cooled in pliant, crystalline caress. But there, what whirring rush of pinions flashing, what churns that lambent glass, with stir and splashing? The timid maidens scatter, and at once the queen remains alone, but calm her glance. With woman's proud complacency, she sees the splendid swan prince, nestling to her knees, intrusive tame. He grows inured, serene, but of a sudden mist, a vaporous gauze arises, and a close-meshed curtain draws about the most enchanting scene. And so she will be impregnated by Zeus in the form of a swan and give birth to Helen. So notice that even Faust, too, is having a dream of a conjunctio between a man and a woman, a conceptual conjunctio. In a sense, in the previous scene when he had had the phallic key in his hand and then he reached out to grab Helen, that sort of in a way was a conception that ends up producing the homunculus in the next scene, which results directly from that conception. But here in this conception, we have the actual, Faust is dreaming of the actual birth of Helen, And now they're going to go in quest of Helen. Except that Homunculus now, when we enter into the classical Walpurgisnacht, Homunculus is in quest of a body because he represents a disembodied soul who is looking to incarnate, as we all have done actually, into a physical body. So that's his quest. And each of the three of them, Mephistopheles, Faust, and Homunculus, will each go on a separate adventure through the classical Walpurgisnacht. Faust will be searching his Grail, will be searching for Helen, Homunculus for a body, and Mephistopheles is just having fun, bouncing around while the various classical creatures like sphinxes and griffins make fun of him. He doesn't really belong in the classical world. He's a Nordic being, doesn't belong there. And so they agreed to set out here on a quest, and then so let's leave it here because the classical Walpurgis night is very long, so we'll get into that next, and the three different quests of these three beings. And I should also say here that it's very important that we note that each is going on an individual quest, because that's the Faustian myth. It's the myth of the individual Grail quest, not the group. We're not a group civilization. This isn't a Magian consensus, where you have a consensus where we all have to believe the same thing to be a Christian, or to be a Jew, or to be a Muslim. That's the group. The West, the far West, the Faustian West, doesn't do the group. We do the individual. Menschwerdung, the individuation process, as Jung called it, and as is already announced in The Quest of the Holy Grail, a 12th century Cistercian version of the quest that specifically says when the knights set out in quest of the Grail, each goes into the forest where it was darkest and where there was no way or path. That's the West, because you don't follow someone else's path. If it's already a path that's there, that belongs to someone else. We're looking for innovation. Each one of us goes into the forest alone, on our own, by ourselves. That's the Faustian myth, in quest of the Grail, not the group. They don't go forth as a group. And so Goethe here, true to the Faustian tradition and its myth of individuality, in the Faustian tradition, the individual is a metaphysical species unto himself. And so, as Spengler points out, we have the loneliest characters in the history of literature. Hamlet, Faust, Don Quixote, Werther in the Sorrows of Young Werther. These are the loneliest characters in the history of literature, and they're that way for a reason, because they are a production of a metaphysical myth of individuality, which Goethe is very sensitive to here. That's why in many respects Faust, Goethe's Faust, is the primary sacred book of Western civilization that corresponds to the Bible or the Old Testament for the Jews, or the New Testament for the Christians. This is the Third Testament. Everything that makes Western civilization unique is in this book.